Welcome to Napa Valley Inside Out. I'm Latife Hayson, and I am delighted to be hosting this podcast, shining a light on one of the most beautiful and coveted lifestyles in the world. If you're interested in developing a property, planting a vegetable garden, making olive oil, fashion, architecture, interior design, county rules and regulations, biking paths, art, getting into the wine business, farming practices, the tax benefits of owning a vineyard, or the ultimate private tours and tastings, and all the fabulous annual cultural events we enjoy here, and so much more, then you won't want to miss this show. Every week I will be interviewing amazing talent, vintners, entrepreneurs, leaders, consultants, festival organizers, and well-known personalities in the Valley. They will share their knowledge, experience, advice, goals, passions, and their best-kept secrets. Robin Daniel Lail, daughter of highly acclaimed vintner John Daniel Jr., who owned Inglenook Winery from 1936 to 1964, is with us today. Robin grew up at Inglenook Winery, which is now owned by Francis Ford Coppola, and she's as close as you can get to Napa Valley royalty. She's going to take us for a walk down memory lane. Robin, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, Latife, it's my pleasure all the way. It's so much fun to be with you.
Thank you. What an incredible history your family has had. You're 3 generations now. Which started with your great-granduncle, Gustave Niebaum. He came to this country from Helsinki, was born in 1842, and he came here with, not by accident, but with a dream to produce the finest wine, one of the finest wines in the world. What can you tell us about his dream and why he chose Napa Valley? He was only 37 years old when he came, right?
He was. So it's such a great story, and unfortunately it's a very long story because it's circuitous routing that brought him here, which he was a sea captain and spent a great deal of time in Alaska, and then came to San Francisco at the time of the Alaskan Purchase, and was formed a company with a group of men who had also been in Alaska, and they started a company called the Alaska Commercial Company. The Alaska Commercial Company was a worldwide trading company, and when Niebaum arrived, he had a small fortune of $600,000 in San Francisco, and by the time he was 37, that had swelled to $10 million. During the interim period with the commercial company, he had done a good deal of traveling in Europe and had taken up a passion, second passion. His first was the sea, but a second passion for wine. And so he had spent a good deal of time in Napa Valley with friends. There were a lot of people, you may have seen photographs or drawings rather of these wonderful estates that were around before the turn of the 20th century. And I don't know if you know, but there were, in the late 1800s, 200 wineries making wine here in Napa Valley. So someone had gotten the jump on him. Charles Krug was the first commercial winery in 1861. But because he had visited here, he knew that Napa Valley would be the proper place, the right place, where he could make the finest wines in the world.
That was a lot of money back then.
It was a lot of money, absolutely.
It's a lot of money now.
It is, right? A lot. Yes.
Isn't that incredible?
Yes.
Yeah, because, you know, he was, by all accounts, a perfectionist. And I enjoyed this quote that I read that he had said, "I'm going to make a California wine that will be sought by connoisseurs and will command as high a price as the famous French, German and Spanish wines, and I am prepared to spend all the money needed to accomplish that result." And
well,
he did.
Yeah, let me piggyback off that and tell you that his motto was quality, not profit. And my father, John Daniel Jr., who I'm sure we'll be talking about at some point, took that quote right into the 20th century, quality, not profit. And now at Lail Vineyards, I'm delighted to tell you that I'm all about the quality, but I'd love a little profit.
I love it, yes. Yes, yeah. Well, these guys really, it's not at all surprising that they were so successful and had won awards in Europe, in Paris. Your grandfather had, your great-granduncle definitely had before he passed away, which is extraordinary. But they really didn't spare expense. And I did read, we will get to your father, but I did read that if your father, if he didn't like the quality, he didn't release it.
He did not.
And even Andrei Chelichov was like taken back by that from what I read.
And by the way, just for further information, Latife, we follow that practice, and it's a very, very expensive thing to do.
Yes.
But we have a beautiful wine called Georgia, which was just not up to snuff in 2005, and we did not produce a Georgia that year. It wasn't released. So certain things continue.
Yes, the standards stay with the Daniel Lail family lineage. So he was very meticulous and also at the forefront of experimentation in California viticulture. For example, he was one of the first people to start making the vines closer in the vineyard. And what were some of the other leading edge practices you think that he adopted during that time?
Well, there were a number of them, and I think that not only was he meticulous, Latife, but I think he was probably could have been called obsessive compulsive.
Yes.
However, the results of his compulsiveness are fantastic.
Yes,
so no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
But in terms of some of his contributions, which were legion, meter by meter planting. Where did he get that idea? That was from the great growths in Bordeaux. He brought in cuttings from the great vineyards, not only of Bordeaux but also of Burgundy and also of Germany. He was the first man, as far as I know, to package wine in glass. Yes. And remember, I told you that there were all these wineries making wine, and they were shipping it to negociants in San Francisco, who then would make their own blend with no place of origin and ship them across the country by train or around the Cape without refrigeration. So the business, what else did he do? He was a great follower of Louis Pasteur, and as a leftover from his days at sea, which never stopped actually, he would do white kid glove inspection tours of the winery. And his compatriots thought he was a lunatic. They did, you know. Yeah. He was also a pioneer in sorting of grapes when they came to the winery before they went up to the crusher. It just wasn't done. And let me see, what else did he do? So many things. He was the first man, incidentally, to establish a brand. So there was people were not promoting their brands. So Inglenook was the first brand, as far as I know. Once again, you know, I've done a lot of research, but it gets a little tricky. There are lots of different look-sees at things. Not only did he establish the Inglenook brand, but he also set up a marketing program. And this marketing program was extensive and first-rate. And he sold wines from Inglenook all over the world.
Because he had connections.
He did.
Yeah.
But he made connections, and he had a great advertising company, PR company, and marketing company, and they just did brilliant work. And at the time that phylloxera hit the vineyards, which was in the 1890s, it ricocheted back from Europe and hit our vineyards here. It was devastating, and instead of sitting on his chair in his office, he began actively trying to do research to try and figure out if there wasn't a way to quell this disease, you know.
Yeah.
So he was a remarkable man, very special, and he also collected a a wine library, which was the largest in the world, some 600 volumes in 5 different languages, and he read every single volume. So,
oh my
an interesting
Lord.
man.
Very
really.
fascinating, yeah. So he was, one of the things I thought was really interesting was that he was demanded scrupulous cleanliness. And you know, I see that in some of these wineries I go to today, the high-end wineries, the cult wines, that the winemakers will not allow any food anywhere near the caves where the wines are kept. Obviously no smoking or anything like that, but certainly no food allowed anywhere near the wine. So do you know anything about, you know, this, about not just the cleanliness, but about not having the food close to wine, even when the wine's in barrels? Do you know what the theory is behind that?
I don't know specifically what the theory is. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of being pristine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if you're pristine, you're pristine. You're not pristine except for having a hamburger next to your wine tank. You know,
Yeah.
so it is. Today we see a lot of practices that are taken to the nth degree.
Yeah.
And that is one.
Yeah, and he was probably very much like that as well.
I don't think he would have gone for a hamburger next to.
No, no,
I don't think so.
Definitely not. He died in 1908, and he left the winery to his wife Susan Niebaum, who raised your father, John Daniel Jr., at the winery. And so the winery stayed closed for 3 years, and then it was opened again in 1911. And from 1911 until Prohibition in 1920, they won a lot of wonderful awards. And your grandfather ran the winery at that time,
He did.
John Daniel Sr. He ran
Correct.
it, yeah. So then we had Prohibition from 1920 to 1933. Can you tell our viewers why Prohibition came into play and then why it was repealed in 1933?
Well, let me have a whirl at it. It's a fascinating story. There's a very, very good book that was written about Prohibition, and one of the things that I learned from that book was that the whole issue really came to light as early as 1843. And at that time, there were many women who were married to men of German and Italian extraction. And these fellows would go off to work during the day and then stop by the bar on the way home and come home rather soused. And unfortunately, part of their activity, their fun at that time was beating their wives. So these women had absolutely no power whatsoever and no vote, no way of containing this violence. And so there were pods of them that began to form. And when the movement to prohibit alcohol really got going was in the late 1800s, when those people connected with the women who were trying to get the vote. So those two groups merged and became extremely powerful. And the Prohibition movement was gaining strength all the way through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and then made into law in January 1st, 1920. And why was it? Why was there a new amendment to get rid of it?
Yeah,
it was because it was not what people wanted. And you know so well there was a lot of bootlegging going on, and we have all the famous Al Capone and bad boy stories. And here in Napa Valley, there were 2 wineries who continued to make wine during Prohibition, one of which was Beringer, and the other was Beaulieu Vineyards, now BV. And they were making sacramental and medicinal wines. And so during that time period, Inglenook kept its vineyards in pristine shape and sold grapes to Beaulieu.
Ah, that's right, because I knew that was for sacramental purposes. So there's no money to be made. I mean, how did anybody make any money? They ripped their vineyards out, most people, and put in walnut orchards, didn't they?
There were, once again, one of those really sliding numbers. There were between 20,000 and 40,000 acres planted to grapes
at that time,
before Prohibition, and all these wineries, and people did rip out their vineyards. Absolutely they did. And they planted walnuts and prunes and started running cattle. And wineries were closed, of course, and went to kind of ruin. And so that at the time that Prohibition ended in December of 1933, just 10 wineries reopened.
That must have caused enormous hardship on people. You said 200 wineries before Prohibition, and raising their families, and all of a sudden they had to figure out, I mean, were they all making sacramental wine? Probably not.
Oh, no, just those two wineries.
Just those two wineries, yeah. And were the other, I wonder if the other wineries like Inglenook were selling their grapes to them, or they just had to...
Some vineyards, some growers continued, yes. Absolutely. I don't know the number of growers that continued.
Yeah.
But there were not a lot of vineyards. You know, today we only have 45,000 acres planted to grapes. It's just 9% of the valley.
Yes.
So, you know, basically, isn't that huge a growth?
Really, no.
From before.
From before, yeah. And so then, so 13 years goes by, and now all of a sudden you can make wine again. I can imagine there must have been enormous hardship financially for people with this swing when it was firstly came in, and then all of a sudden, you know, you can make wine again, and they've already planted to prunes or walnuts. Very interesting times. But just a horrible story that the women were beaten up then, but then they got the vote afterwards, right? So your grapes went, obviously we went through to Inglenook. Share with us, if you will, the journey from the time your great aunt, Susan, opened the winery again in 1911 until your father took over in 1936. Well, she died in 1936 and left it to him, and then he became the winemaker there in 1939, I think.
Well, that's it. Let me tinker with that a little bit, if I can. And so my father was sent by his father and by Susan Niebaum to reopen the winery in 1933. But he was 26 years old, and he was immediately then an apprentice. So he was an apprentice for 3 years. And during that period of time, Carl Bundschuh was the winemaker, a Inglenook Bundschuh family, and did a brilliant job. The wines he was making were fabulous. My father took over as managing director in 1936 when Susan died, and exactly as you say, she left the winery too, which, by the way, came from an agreement that had been made many years earlier, and that agreement was that my grandfather, John Daniel Sr., was a bit of a not the greatest guy in the world, and when his wife died, my dad was 7 years old, and he had a sister who was 9. And Susan Niebaum took a look at this fellow and said, "You, sir, are not fit to raise these children. I will raise the children." And the man not fit to raise the children was not a total fool, and he said, "I'll let you do that on one condition." And she said, "Well, what is that?" And he said that you leave all your holdings to these children when you die. So that is how that transition into a completely different family took place.
Oh, that's amazing. So that was nice that he didn't want to take it for himself. He wanted it for his children. That's fantastic.
Well, he figured never mind.
Okay, we won't go there.
We won't go there.
And so your father became the winemaker in 1939, or was he the managing director at 1939?
No, he was the managing director as of 1936. And George Dewar became the winemaker.
Oh, so George Dewar stayed. Okay. And they made amazing wines once again.
They did.
Yeah.
They did. And you know what's really fun, Latife, and not so well known, is that my father was Robert Mondavi's mentor in the wine business. And Bob, if I remember properly, and I may be a year or two off, graduated from Stanford in 1937 and was just fascinated by the wine business. Got his dad to come over and make a partnership with Jack Riorda at Sunny St. Helena Winery. And then in 1943, they bought Krug and so forth. But my dad and Bob Mondavi shared the vision that Napa Valley could make wine second to none in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so they set out to prove that. And we all know so well that Bob carried that forward.
Mm-hmm.
And not too long ago, I was sitting in a tasting with Robert Parker, and he said, you know, Robin, I want to tell you something. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, I think I'm qualified to say this, but I believe that Napa Valley is making the best wines in the world today.
Wow.
So that was very exciting, and
Yes.
I put eyes to heaven for my dad and Bob and said,
Yes.
well done.
Yes.
Well
no,
done.
I read that they were the two biggest, supporters of the wine, the believers that this area could make some of the best wines in the world, and which it has many times over, and continues to, and is has been awarded for. Incredible. And we'll get more. We'll get on. We're going to talk about Lail Vineyards and you with Robert Mondavi in our next show. But there was a historian, L.R. Gomberg, who was quoted as saying that when the historical dust has cleared away and the full story of California wine is written, John Daniel Jr. will take his place as one of the truly outstanding men in the history of the industry. And he really was an amazing, amazing winemaker. And he must have learned a lot from, well, he wouldn't have actually learned a lot from his great-grandfather, grand-uncle, would he?
No.
But
No.
somehow it stayed with the winery, and the way that winery was managed and the vineyards were managed, it stayed for generations, right?
It has. And, basically remember that my father was raised as a Victorian, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Susan Niebaum was quite Victorian.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had a very strong code of ethics. But in addition to that, he had a huge passion for the business and for the legacy that had been established by Niebaum and carried forward by his father. But principally, his allegiance was to Niebaum. And he saw himself, Latife, as a caretaker. Not as a builder, but as a caretaker. And he said to me many times as a child, all this will be yours one day. So this is a very dangerous thing to say to my sister and I, or any child for that matter, because you can mean it with all your heart and be hell-bent for election to make it happen, but things do happen sometimes, and it's not possible to carry forward in that way. But let me go back to Dad. Dad was, he was extraordinary, and I would call him a Renaissance gentleman. And his great contributions to the wine business were his stewardship of the legacy, because of its importance to the rebirth of this business, which was so slow.
After Prohibition, very slow?
Very slow.
Yes.
So by the time the first wine auction started, there were, at that time, only 36 vintners. And today we have purportedly 1,050 producers in Napa Valley. So you can see that there's been this huge gusher, particularly from the 90s forward. Back to Dad. So Dad was not the winemaker. George Dewar was the winemaker. But of course, they worked together in terms of making these blends. And
It's okay.
His Cabernets are absolutely legendary, absolutely spectacular. And today, even now.
Yeah.
Wines from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And what's interesting to me, among other things, is that he was one of the pioneers of varietal labeling.
Oh,
He's a great
interesting.
proponent of that, getting rid of the Chablis and the whatever the word just went out of my mind, clarets and so forth.
Yes.
And calling the things a spade, or a rose, a rose, if you will. And so... but at that time, it was only necessary to have 50% of the varietal in a bottle to call it a Cabernet or Sauvignon Blanc or whatever. So sometimes I must admit to wondering exactly what else was in those bottles, to create this amazing longevity and beauty and style. I mean, and by the way, I also had an opportunity to taste wines that were made in Niebaum's time.
Wow.
Cabernets from 1897, and we have a few old wines in our cellars still from before the turn of the 20th century. But these particular wines, there were 3 of them, and long story how I came upon them, but they were extraordinary. Just fabulous, beautiful structure, great color, didn't blow off in the glass, a hint of fruit, elegant. They were thrilling.
So where are all those wines now? The Inglenook wines?
Francis
has he does.
He has a very beautiful cellar, yes. So he got the majority of the wines. Some of them were sold at auction after my father's death by Hubline when they owned the property.
Yes, I wanted to get to that. So in 1964, at the age of 55, your father sold the winery. You were down in San Francisco. I think this was 2 years after you had graduated from Stanford. Mm-hmm. And he sold the winery in 1964. And you were working for Bank of America in San Francisco. How did that affect you? I mean, you must have been stunned by that.
I was devastated, but I have to tell you at the same time, Latife, that in a way it wasn't surprising. And the reason for that, all this will be yours one day, whoops, why it wasn't surprising is that my mother was what got in the way here.
Yes, yeah.
And she decided that my sister and I would be raised in the Mormon Church, mm-hmm. which is a fabulous religion, but does not appreciate the idea of wine.
Right.
So that kind of cut us right out of the opportunity to go into the business. Mm-hmm. So there was wine on our dinner table every night, and we were allowed to smell the wine, but not to taste the wine. Long story short, I would drive through the vineyards with my dad, on a Sunday afternoon, and he would say, the Cabernet is on the right, please notice the shape of the leaves, and the Chardonnay is on the left. These wonderful things. So I played in the vineyards. I grew up in the wine business,
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Dad never spoke about the wine business at the dinner table. What a shame. What a real shame. What a loss to me and Marky, my sister. But so basically, when he was 55, and you know very well that in the 1960s, 55 was old. It was old then. I can remember people celebrating their 50th anniversary being wheeled in wheelchairs, kind of with a bowl of porridge. So he knew that the winery needed a financial infusion at that time. And so in thinking it over, he thought, well, it'll be 10 years before I get a return on this investment. Mm-hmm. I'll be 65. Mm-hmm. And there's no one to leave the property to, the winery to, so I'll have to go on and sell. For me, to get back after that long-winded response,
that's good.
To how I felt, I just felt this devastation that this beautiful legacy, please know that this man not only had his own passion, but he shared it with his children, the passion for the land and the passion. And we were of the land, and we played in the land, and we grew up in the land, and it was part of our hearts and souls, as was the winery. I would walk home from school and stop at the winery and go into the tasting room and have a glass of ice water in a wine glass, and then I would go and pester everyone in the winery and see what things were going on. And then during harvest, when people, it's marvelous, and I looked for arrowheads in the vineyards because we had Indian mounds. It was part of my being, and so it was very sad. And I thought it was over, and I took that attitude forward.
Yeah,
no possibility to recreate that in one generation. Yeah.
No. So much more to talk about. I'm going to have you back to talk about Lail Vineyards and your journey and how you ended up changing your mind about being in the wine industry. I do want to ask you, how old were you when you tasted your first wine, before we go?
Oh my goodness, that's really a leading question. I probably tasted wine when I was in high school, but not at the dinner table.
Right.
You know, probably out and about. And I can tell you a funny story, which is the first time that I went to a wine tasting, a formal wine tasting, I went with my father. And I was in my first year at Stanford, and I said, Dad, what do I do? What do I do if the wine just tastes terrible? And he said, you do this. He said, you pick up the glass, you look in the glass, you hold it up to your nose, you smell the wine, you taste the wine again, you set the glass down on the table, you look into the eyes of the person pouring the wine, and you say, that is really interesting.
Oh my God, I love it. He was a gentleman, wasn't he? Your
Yes.
Renaissance man.
He was.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be right back after this, and so we'll be doing an interview on Lail Vineyards, and we'll say goodbye to everybody today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.